We'll be working together.
I'm a hitter.
You're partnering with one of the most ruthless mobsters in history.
The upcoming film By Any Means from Paramount, starring Mark Wahlberg, has dropped some amazing teasers, and people are going batshit crazy over them. Now, we do have an idea that the movie is inspired from a true story, but as with any adaptations, the movie seems to be taking some creative liberties, introducing characters and even watering down the roles of other significant players in the story. And that's where I come in, folks, to tell you some insane true facts about the main people involved in the case that shook Mississippi back in the 60s.
There's no witness. There's no crime.
Let these crackers know their consequences.
So what is the true story on which By All Means is banking? The official synopsis reads as, the film follows a young black FBI agent who's sent into 1960s Mississippi to investigate a wave of brutal killings targeting civil rights leaders. Forced to work alongside notorious mafia hitman Greg Scarpa, he finds himself pulled into a deadly hunt where justice and vengeance begin to blur. And anyone who's a nerd about real-life crimes has probably connected Elegance Bratton's directorial to the real-life 1964 Mississippi civil rights murders and the FBI's controversial decision to secretly enlist Colombo crime family hitman Gregory Scarpa. See, this was a time when standing up for civil rights in Mississippi would make someone a target for the police. However, this was the period when the region needed activism because chaos was at its peak. There was news of bombings, murders every other day, and the African American communities were specifically tortured by white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. The attacks increased as activists fought to end racial segregation and help the African Americans register to vote. As a result, the era saw some gruesome murders of civil rights advocates like James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. It was against this backdrop that Vernon Dahmer, a pretty influential activist, was killed by the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi. In January 1966, Klansmen threw Molotov cocktails through the window of his home, and while Dahmer bravely fought back with a rifle and helped his wife and children escape, he suffered severe burns and succumbed to his injuries the next day. His daughter, Betty Dahmer, recalled on an episode of the Cold Case Files, "When I could look at my daddy and see that the skin was literally hanging off him like a sheet of paper, he never complained. He never cried. He was just concerned that we stay out of the reflection of the light from the house." Who exactly was Vernon Dahmer? The character, which will be played by Giancarlo Esposito, was one of the most vocal activists against oppression of African Americans in the 60s. We've seen Esposito in various movies and shows, and he's an absolutely amazing performer. But somehow, every time I see him, my mind screams, Gus. I'm probably not the only one. It'll be interesting to see how Esposito plays a role where he would be the victim. That too in a crime aided by a mob hitman. Yep, the tables have turned. Anyway, Vernon Dahmer was not a random name on the KKK's hit list. He was one of the leading figures during the Hattiesburg civil rights movements who played a crucial role in organizing and mobilizing the protest. Dahmer, who was a cotton farmer by profession, also owned a grocery store and worked as a sawmill operator. But all he could think about was uplifting the African American community and supporting the broader suffrage movement. He was so involved in it that he even offered to pay the poll tax for the people who could not afford it. Unfortunately, he was mercilessly hunted down just a day after he announced this on the radio. Dahmer dedicated his entire life to advocate for the rights of people. Eventually, Vernon Dahmer was elected as the president of the local NAACP branch of Forest County twice. And then he hoped to establish a youth NAACP chapter in Hattiesburg along with Medgar Evers, another civil rights activist, and opened his home to freedom riders and voter registration workers. Yes, he actually turned his home and shop into safe houses for people. In fact, when he was working with local organizers and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, to organize and support Hattiesburg's Historical Freedom Day demonstration on January 22, 1964, SNCC volunteers were given space in his shop. The place famously came to be known as Home Away from Home. Among them were figures like Hollis Watkins and Curtis Hayes, who used the place to plan voter registration campaigns. Dahmer even employed some of the volunteers, and it just proves how he put his livelihood and home on stake to fight for justice. From fighting in the courtroom against lawsuits challenging discriminatory voter registration practices to him and his wife, Ellie, watching in shifts, anticipating an attack at any time, Vernon Dahmer's contribution to the civil rights movement is absolutely insane. He was a totally dedicated and selfless dude. The mafia hitman the FBI secretly turned to. Gregory Scarpa, the role taken up by Mark Wahlberg, actually belonged to New York's Colombo crime family. Scarpa was the leader, and his reputation as a ruthless mafia boss earned him the moniker the Grim Reaper. The man happened to cross paths with the FBI when, in 1962, he was arrested in connection with an armed robbery. But the FBI knew that Scarpa was no petty criminal, and in order to avoid facing charges, Gregory played a master card. He agreed to become a confidential FBI informant and supply details about organized crime syndicates to the government agents. Mind you, this arrangement did not put Scarpa on the FBI payroll. He was still very much a mob hitman. And Scarpa continued living this dual life for years. At one point, he was classified as a top echelon informant. Okay, that's really weird. One of the greatest government agencies ended up making a deal with the devil and now considered him to be an especially valuable source. So what did Scarpa get out of this bargain? Turns out his handlers overlooked some extreme criminal activity of his, and reportedly, they let several of his violent behaviors and even murders slide. Scarpa eventually reached Mississippi in 1964 and was tasked by the FBI to investigate the disappearance of civil rights advocates James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. Since agents were struggling to get information from local suspects, Scarpa became their choice of weapon, and understandably, some accounts note that the hitman resorted to brutal methods to force information from a Klan-connected suspect. So the man was already involved in the KKK versus civil rights workers, and when Vernon Dahmer was murdered, he was once again brought in to help the police. Scarpa was already listed as a New York informant under the designation NY3461. According to accounts of Scarpa's FBI history, the FBI's Jackson, Mississippi office requested permission to use Scarpa in the investigation, and that's how he returned to Mississippi once again. R. Lindley DeVecchio, the FBI agent who became Scarpa's handler. So who was Scarpa reporting to? The man who handled him was actually a veteran FBI agent, R. Lindley DeVecchio, whose specialization was in organized crimes and dealing with mafia informants. Now, when DeVecchio's work led him to the crime families of Colombo and Bonanno, he became involved with Scarpa. I'm not sure of the timeline which DeVecchio and Scarpa's relationship the film will follow, but in reality, he became Scarpa's handler much later in the 80s, and that pact worked until 1992. And what happened in these 12 years was unbelievable. For starters, DeVecchio became Scarpa's sole handler, and that was pretty unusual because FBI informants were normally handled by 2 agents. However, an exception was made for Scarpa since he reportedly refused to deal with anyone else. But what's worse was how close DeVecchio got with Scarpa. A Justice Department investigation later found that DeVecchio had passed on unauthorized FBI information to his mafia informant because, for some goddamn reason, Scarpa was sometimes receiving information about FBI investigations and law enforcement activity. In fact, one federal judge even described the relationship as a potential illegal two-way street. There were also allegations that DeVecchio leaked information about those who were cooperating with the authorities and rival factions within the Colombo crime family. Finally, in 1992, when water reached above the FBI's head, they temporarily shut Scarpa down as an informant after getting a valid tip that he was planning something horrible. Yet, DeVecchio defended him and pushed to have him back in the agency. However, it wasn't long before Scarpa was ultimately charged with 3 killings, of which he later pleaded guilty to 2 of them. Of course, questions about all of this happening under DeVecchio's nose emerged, and the controversy became so serious that DeVecchio himself was put on trial. In 2006, he was indicted on allegations that he had helped Scarpa commit 4 murders by giving him secret information. But here's the catch. When Scarpa's longtime girlfriend, Linda Skiro, the prosecution's key witness, entered the picture, I'll tell you what Linda did. Her involvement led to DeVecchio's charges being dropped and he walked away scot-free. Linda Skiro, the mobster's girlfriend whose own words helped save an FBI agent. I've been a pretty big fan of The Sopranos, so Gregory Scarpa having an extramarital affair and a girlfriend for around 30 years didn't really surprise me. Given her intimate connection with Scarpa, she got the chance to experience the activities of the Colombo crime family closely, and had already been a witness to several meetings Scarpa and DeVecchio had. Of course, that made her the most important witness against Lindley DeVecchio and brought her into the courtroom. When the allegations against DeVecchio were made, Linda testified that she saw Scarpa giving valuables to DeVecchio, like cash, jewelry, liquor, and even a Cabbage Patch doll for him. However, when journalist Tom Robbins produced recordings of interviews that he conducted with crime reporter Jerry Capecci in 1997, it was found that Linda's account was very different. For example, in those tapes, she said explicitly that DeVecchio was not responsible for the murder of Larry Lampassi, when prosecutors claimed that DeVecchio himself informed Scarpa about the opposing faction. Back then, Linda said, "Lynn didn't do that. I know it for a fact." Though Linda tried justifying that whatever she told the reporters were made-up stories for the proposed book they were apparently trying to make, and that her courtroom testimony was the truth, the judge ultimately ruled out whatever she said on the stand. Without any real evidence supporting the murder charges against DeVecchio, the prosecutors dropped the case in the middle of the trial. Linda herself faced investigation when a special prosecutor concluded that those tapes could not prove whether Linda had committed perjury during DeVecchio's murder trial, and tried to find whether she had deliberately lied under oath. However, since the prosecutor couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she had knowingly lied, she could never be charged. Edgar Ray Killen, the Klan leader behind one of Mississippi's most brutal murders. The Ku Klux Klan is probably one of the darkest corners in American history, and digging through them has never been a pleasure. However, given the movie has listed Devere Gell to play Edgar Ray Killen, let's check out what a monstrous person he was. Killen was a Baptist minister and led the Klan's murders of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. And oh boy, the details of how he and the group killed those people are absolutely skin-crawling. According to reports, on June 21, 1964, the three civil rights activists were arrested by Neshoba County Deputy Sheriff Cecil Ray Price. Price contacted Killen and told him that the three men were in custody, and based on the evidence presented in the case, Killen then helped organize the Klansmen to ambush them once they were released. Reportedly, he even arranged to have himself dropped off at a funeral home to create an alibi. Now, when the three men left from the jail that fateful night, they were followed by several Klansmen. Price, too, helped them, and ultimately, Cheney and his companions were driven to an isolated road called Rock Cut Road, and were killed off one by one. Some accounts note that Cheney was particularly subjected to extreme brutality and was beaten before being shot. The three bodies were then loaded into a station wagon and taken to the Old Jolly Farm, where the killers used a bulldozer to bury them under an earthen dam. The Klansmen did everything to remove evidence, including burning the station wagon and pushing it into a swamp. Though it was understandable that the Klan was responsible for these gruesome murders, Killen was not convicted during the original trial in 1967. Apparently, one juror refused to convict him because he was a minister, and it took another 38 years before Mississippi reopened the case. Finally, in 2005, an 80-year-old Killen was finally convicted of 3 counts of manslaughter and sentenced to 60 years in prison. He died behind bars in 2018 at the age of 92. Lawrence Byrd, the Klan suspect Scarpa allegedly tortured for a confession. Remember I told you that Scarpa allegedly used ruthless measures to get information out of a Klan suspect? The suspect in question was Lawrence Byrd. Byrd was a businessman in Laurel, Mississippi, and owned Byrd's radio and TV service. During Dahmer's murder, he reportedly held a leadership position within the Klan, and thus became the prime suspect for the FBI. According to some accounts, Scarpa and another FBI agent walked into Byrd's television store pretending to be customers and even picked out a television. Then they asked Byrd to help carry it outside, and the moment he stepped outside, everything changed. In an account published by The New Yorker, Scarpa stated that the agent supposedly hit Byrd with his pistol before shoving him into the back of a car and driving him to a military camp Camp Shelby. And then Scarpa took over. He allegedly kept on beating Bird till he confessed, and a district attorney later claimed that Bird was beaten so badly that he was never the same afterward. He ended up signing a 22-page confession prepared by the FBI, incriminating himself and 7 other members of the Klan. Bird was sentenced to 10 years for arson, but conveniently enough, the FBI never officially confirmed the Scarpa story. However, that doesn't tone down what Bird did. Reports from the Mississippi Supreme Court said that Bird and Sam Bowers openly discussed the need to burn Dahmer's home and kill him. They also organized a recce before burning down the property, and Byrne said he could not participate that day due to back problems, but was present at later meetings. Greg Scarpa Jr. followed his father into the mafia. The son of Gregory Scarpa didn't hesitate before stepping into his father's dark world. He grew up around organized crime, and it was only a matter of time before he would become the captain of the Colombo crime family. Gregory Scarpa Jr.'s criminal record was absolutely horrifying, and federal authorities believed he was either directly responsible or attached in some capacity to numerous killings in the 80s. In fact, they attributed at least 11 murders between 1980 and 1987 to Scarpa Jr., including the deaths of Albie Variali, Ray Shapiro, and Anthony Frezza. However, the most bizarre death he was linked to was that of Joseph Brewster DiDomenico. DiDomenico was actually a member of Scarpa's gang and took part in bank robberies with him. When DeVecchio was accused of aiding Scarpa in several murders, it was reported that DeVecchio had told Scarpa about DiDomenico's burglaries behind his back. He even told Scarpa that they couldn't keep DiDomenico around and that Scarpa had to, quote, do something about him, unquote. And soon, DiDomenico was found dead. Scarpa Jr.'s criminal activities went in all directions as the young crime boss got involved in extortion, narcotics trafficking, and even racketeering. And you know what's the most unsettling part? When the federal agents were planning to arrest him and his gang members in 1987, over a connection with criminal activity at the Wimpy Boys Social Club, DeVecchio reportedly saved him. The Justice Department's Inspector General stated that there was evidence of DeVecchio tipping off Gregory Scarpa Sr. about the planned DEA operation, allowing Scarpa Jr. to flee. Scarpa Jr. was finally arrested in 1988 and spent over 3 decades in jail, but received a compassionate release in 2020 after he developed cancer. Interestingly, Scarpa Jr. too worked as an informant while serving his sentence. Alright guys, that's all we have for today. The Scarpa's family's dealings with the FBI and the cruel silenced deaths carried out by the Ku Klux Klan are a grim rabbit hole. But these were the facts that were at the top of my mind. I'm really intrigued to see how the movie handles such a sensitive topic, but given the team behind it, I hope we get to see some of these really dark stories that don't get acknowledged so often. Do drop some more interesting facts in the comments below, and if you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!